After the Rockefeller Foundation decided that they would begin replacing their armed forces with mobile dolls, the organization has found itself divided. Treize Kushrenada has resigned from his post and is imprisoned at Rockefeller's headquarters, and Lady Un is grievously wounded after attempting to free the Gundam pilots before they could be murdered by Tuberov. Elsewhere, the incredibly powerful Wing Zero was intercepted by 2 other Gundam pilots, which left Hiroyui wounded and Troll Barton assumed to be killed in action. It is here that the world will lose a sense of itself, and a nation that preaches total pacifism will once again rise to prominence. In this series of Gundam Explained, we're taking the time to break down the numerous conflicts that spin out of Operation Meteor in the After Colony timeline. Now, since the start, the 5 Gundam pilots have found themselves like soldiers with no nation, as the colonies seem to have rejected the pilots' original mission in exchange for Oz's rule, and the pilots themselves have either gone mad, in the case of Catra Winter, or have steeled their resolve, in the cases of Hiroyui, Wu Fei Chang, and Duo Maxwell. So now we enter the next phase of the war, and boy howdy is there a lot to discuss. Let's go ahead and get started. Episode 3, The Glass Kingdom. Now this episode is going to start with something called Operation Nova. After Treize's resignation, there's a number of Oz soldiers calling themselves the Treize faction that have splintered from Oz in protest of Rockefeller's usage of mobile dolls. So given that this is Rockefeller, they've begun Operation Nova to basically destroy any resistance. So, how's the Treize faction do against these Virgo mobile dolls? Oh. Well, crap. That's not good. On the moon, both Catra and Hiro have been captured. Now, what Tuberov doesn't know is that the Treize faction are on the moon as well, and managed to snag the Gundam pilots, because they're working with the Gundam engineers. Elsewhere, Tuberov's men are testing out the cockpit system inside of Wing Zero. Now, this is one element of this mobile suit that I did not talk about last time in depth, because I honestly felt like it deserved its own section, and we were running kinda long in the last video anyway. The cockpit system inside Wing Zero is called the Zero System. Now, the Zero System is described as, and I quote, analyzing a given situation based on the massive amounts of data collected by its various sensors, which it transmits multiple possible responses as well as the results directly into the pilot's brain so as to achieve total victory. Now, what does that mean in English? It basically means that it's a probability engine. Imagine a computer that's synced up with your brain that tells you where your enemies are and what the best course of action are to beat them, and the probability that that action's actually going to work instantaneously on a consistent basis during a fight. Now, given how big a space battle or a ground battle can be in Gundam, and given how hectic any form of combat always has been throughout history, as you can imagine, it's processing and sending a lot of data constantly to your brain, and it would be very difficult to keep up. Now, as we go on in this series, you're going to see that the system has a tendency to have adverse effects on pilots and their mental states, if they survive using it at all. And the images that the system will sometimes show you go beyond just the fight that you're in, and flat out will show you possible futures. Now, let's talk about something that's interesting about Wing Zero. There's a fairly popular fan theory that's pretty plausible about it. Given that Zero's system basically acts as a brain for the mobile suit that feeds information to the pilot's brain, and the two work in tandem, the question is whether or not Wing Zero is self-aware. Now, of all of the Gundam Wing fan theories out there, this is one I can actually see being true. During the course of this show, one thing you're going to consistently see from Wing Zero isn't just the communications of probability, but rather communication of things that could, or maybe should, happen. Now, I'm of the opinion that the communication of those specific ideas, honestly, would require some sort of sentience and desire, a will, effectively, to see a certain future play out. It's an interesting idea that ended up inspiring the Pale Rider in the Universal Century, and Gundam Ariel's big secret seems like an evolution of these ideas. Anyway, I don't know for sure if Wing Zero is actually sentient and self-aware, but as we go on, I will bring up the things that make people think that, and I will admit I do lean towards that theory. Anyway, the doctors bring everyone up to speed, and one thing that the doctors tell Hiro and Catra is that they are imperfect soldiers, and if they're going to beat the fuck out of the mobile dolls, they're going to need to get their minds set on beating their enemies. The other option is go insane, because that's what wars do to people. The next conversation between Catra and Hiro kind of gives insight into why it is that the Zero system overwhelmed Catra, since the doctors basically spelled that out. Catra's really got no fucking clue who his real enemies are at this point, since it seems like up is down and black is white to him in regards to space. Hiro, on the other hand, seems to have a much more simplified idea of matters. Your enemy is whoever's trying to kill you. Now, what's fascinating is that Oz wants to keep studying the Zero system for some reason. Well, some people in it do anyway, because they find it fascinating, and they want to go behind Tuberov's back to do it. In a short armistice between factions on the base, the Gundam pilots are lent to Oz in return for the lives of the Treize faction members, and they're going to take the doctors as hostages. So, Hiro hops into Wing Zero, and in a simulation, he's fucking murking mobile dolls left and right. Now, when Hiro's in Wing Zero suddenly wakes up and starts kicking ass, quite literally. This thing only has 2 of its 3 main weapons, and it just starts making jokes out of several Virgo units. Thing is, we start to see that the Zero system is starting to fuck with Hiro. It goes from everyone who wants to kill him is an enemy to everyone who wants to toy with him is an enemy, which he sees as the doctors, which is not good. Also, Oz can't call for backup because Tuberov will get pissed. Dumbasses. Anyway, Catra hops into a one-armed Mercurius, and there is a brief scuffle between the mobile suits, but in the fight and ensuing conversation, Hiro snaps out of his funk, and as he falls out of the cockpit, sees a vision of Relena, all in an Obi-Wan Kenobi style. So the conclusion at this point is that these two need to head back to Earth. Now, one thing is that Hiro comes out of it with a bit of a glow, and somehow Catra is able to sort of sense his intentions. Again, in a way, I can see why people were thinking that they were hinting at new types here, but they never really pulled the trigger on it. Spoilers. Now, one thing that's interesting that they also hint here in regards to Wing Zero possibly being self-aware is that when Wing Zero sees Catra pick up Hiro, it deactivates. And not before. And Catra basically talks to the mobile suit like it's a living person. It's one of those little things that makes me think that they were leaning towards the idea of Wing Zero being self-aware. Anyway, the Mercurius detonates right in Wing Zero's face. Hiro and Catra escape the lunar base in a stolen shuttle, and even though Wing Zero had that explosion happen in its face, when the doctors find it, it's just scuffed up and looks like it's sitting in front of a campfire. Though this image of Zero surrounded by fire is pretty badass, I almost expect the mobile suit to have a giant acoustic guitar and cowboy hat while it's chilling out here. Now, in regards to Earth, Relena's back, and to no one's surprise, she's thinking about Hiro. Treize is basically just taking in the view from a carriage where he's at on Earth. Now, episodes 27 and 28 is where we're at with Gundam Wing in this little breakdown of mine. And it was around this time that the director of the show had changed from Masashi Ikeda to Shinji Takamatsu, who prior to this was the director of Brave Express Might Guine, Brave Police Jadecker, and The Brave of Gold, Goldran. As I was saying, the recap episodes for Wing are really only worth watching if you're curious about some insights that Treize and Relena will give you about the conflict, but that's about it. Anyway, at this point we find Relena meeting with the other leaders of different nations that are wanting to express total pacifism. We find out that while we've been in space, Relena has actually taken over as the head of the recently freed Sanc Kingdom, taking the role of princess and filling her father's shoes. As for Hiro and Catra, they've arrived on Earth and Roma Feller is actively hunting them. Now, where exactly are they? Well, they're playing with a couple of very good boys. And they're also staying with a military unit nearby that's not really the biggest fans of Roma Feller, but they're in a tough spot when it comes to handing over these pilots. It's either that or get killed. Somewhere else, Sally Poe crashes a plane into the sea trying to get away from Oz, but she ends up captured anyway. Fortunately for her, Lieutenant Noin's around to break her out of Oz's clutches. As you probably guessed, there is a Gundam in that carrier. Specifically, Gundam 01, Wing Gundam. The reason Noin's after it is because she's fully aware that Roma Feller is only going to tolerate the Sanc Kingdom's existence for so long, since it exists in opposition to the militaristic approach of Roma Feller. So the strategy is simple. Get the Gundams, get their pilots, use them as a deterrent against Roma Feller's military forces. As for Catra and Hiro, they do their thing. They get on an Oz carrier and steal it at gunpoint. Yeah, an entire mobile suit carrier by themselves. Noin and Sally Poe do their own badass stuff and fuck up the Oz units and take Wing Gundam, then head out in their different directions. After this, we meet Eyebrows! Sorry. That's Dorothy Catalonia, the granddaughter of Duke Dermail Catalonia. Yeah, the same fascistic fuck who runs the Romefeller Foundation. So what's her gimmick aside from eyebrows? She loves war. No, seriously, we can sum up her worldview with this clip from Hellsing Ultimate.
My friends, it has often been said that I like war. My friends, I like war. No? Friends, I love war. I love holocausts. I love blitzkriegs. I love defensive lines. I love sieges, charges. I love mop-up operations and retreats.
Yeah, she's a weird one. She does say that she does have real respect for what Relina is trying to do, but how seriously you take it is going to depend on what language you're listening to her in. In Japanese, her voice is going to sound familiar. It's Naoko Matsui, the voice of Ru Luca from Double Zeta, the show with the best Universal Century dude ever, Judo Ashita, and I will hear no different. Anyway, Matsui tends to voice her with an air of grace, and it comes across like war is something that fascinates her. In English, she's voiced by Kathy Weseluk, who voices Katie Mannequin in Gundam 00, and is also the English voice of Mirai Yashima in the original Gundam and in Char's Counterattack. The interesting thing about her English portrayal of Dorothy Catalonia is you really get the sense that Dorothy's there to test Relina's worldview on a consistent basis, which is what she does. So in a sense, the Japanese version seems like Dorothy is masking her true intentions with respect, and in the English version, her confidence in her own beliefs over Relina's ideas is a lot more open, but she does, again, mask these things with, well, what seems to be some sort of a respect, but it seems a little bit more twisted, sort of like a sort of bless your soul sort of attitude. By the way, both performances are really good, but it's really interesting how those small details can change from actress to actress in this case. Elsewhere, fighting is still breaking out between the Oz factions, and Hiro's more than willing to fight against Romefeller. So in just a Leo, he's kicking the crap out of much more advanced suits than what he's got. And like I mentioned, you can't sleep on a Leo if there's a good pilot in them. Regardless, we see Oz do Oz things and start having people round up grown men to fight the Treize faction for them. But the nation that they're in are pacifists. Yeah, Oz doesn't care. They don't even let the town they're in evacuate as a battle starts up nearby. Well, these Oz soldiers don't really do that well against the Treize faction due to a mix of ambush tactics and having Hiro Yui. Even so, the battle's doing damage to the town itself, and Catra's not too pleased about Hiro wanting to get involved in these fights. Now, Hiro notices there are still civilians and broadcasts on an open channel that he's a Gundam pilot, to both draw the fire of the Oz troops and to freak them out. It seems like the presence of the civvies brings Hiro to a point where he agrees that this was a bad idea, and he signals that he's leaving the battle. Over in the Sanc Kingdom, we see that Relina is currently teaching a class on the philosophy of total pacifism, and it's interesting to hear this idea talked about. Relina's not Lacus Klein, because A, she's got an actual character with flaws who makes mistakes and learns from them, and B, she's not under the impression that the words, everyone stop fighting, is actually going to fucking mean anything. She says in this class that the only way that this philosophy of hers really is going to work long term is a unilateral adoption of it and disarmament of forces. Basically, in simpler terms, every nation on Earth would have to adopt the idea and disarm themselves. One thing that I'm happy we're going to get to talk about is this is the challenge to Relina's ideas, and ultimately why I'm still so high on the show over 20 years after I first saw it. Spoilers, Dorothy's a villain. I know, surprise, surprise. We could tell from the eyebrows! Sorry. Anyway, what's interesting about this conversation is that Dorothy's basically challenging Relina and saying she's a bit naive. She argues that humans are inclined towards fighting, and she believes that it's something that is just natural for humans to do, and it's an inevitability. I find this to be an interesting back and forth between the two characters because there's truth in what both of them are saying. Humans in the human condition, we tend to be very contradictory. We will often say that fighting is pointless and ultimately doesn't solve anything. Violence is something to be avoided at all costs, and we shouldn't do it. At the same time, there's also the truth that humans do have an inclination towards the use of violence in certain scenarios. Fight or flight, for example, is part of who we are, and even when we're not at war, we have a fascination with combat. Just as an example, I don't think that the world would have such a fascination with combat sports like boxing, kickboxing, and MMA if we didn't find violence fascinating. Heck, some people are just built differently in regards to this sort of thing. Speaking as someone who's trained in both boxing and Muay Thai, when you spar with people who are competitors or just enjoy being in the ring, you start to realize that some people just thrive in those sorts of conditions. In an interesting way, both Relina and Dorothy are speaking to two different elements of the human condition, and it's interesting to see the worldviews clash, and you honestly have to wonder, are they both right in some ways? Can the two ideas coexist, and can we find a middle ground here? And then there are some people out there that think that Kigali is crying is superior writing. Seriously, Gundam Seek could go fuck itself. I'm not stopping. Anyway, Romefeller's done fucking around with this nation that Catra and Hito are in, and they brought out mobile dolls. So that's bad news. The good news is that Pagan has been in contact with Lieutenant Noin, and Noin is on her way to pick up Hito and Catra. Hito's in a bit of a pinch, though. He's on a firing line with the Treize faction, and they run into the Virgos, which the Leos just don't have a way of competing with whatsoever, unless you get in very close. Over with the Civies, Catra comes to the conclusion that they definitely also need to head Relina's way after hearing about the Sanc Kingdom from one of the civilians, so he decides to steal an Ares. Hito, despite the damage to his Leo, is planning to continue the fight, but that thing's not going to be able to do much with one arm. So Catra comes in to back him up and blows up a Virgo by punching it. Yeah. Anyway, Noin's here, and she brought a great solution to a lot of problems. Gun!
Laser gun.
You cursed brat! Look what you've done! I'm melting! Melting! Oh, what a world! What a world! To victory!
So, the guys reunite with Relina after all of that. Everyone's happy, right? See? Anyway, sometime later the boys are having a talk about what's necessary for the Gundam pilots to do at this point. Catra wants to stick around and defend the Sanc Kingdom, whereas Hito disagrees and wants to take off with his suit. Either way, the guys get ogled by the girls at the school and talk to Relina about their intentions. One thing that Relina informs them about is she's using resources to try and find out if Troa is still alive. Now, we in the audience already know he is, but still. It's a nice gesture, to say the least. Now, Hito is still insistent that more Gundam pilots in the nation is going to be trouble for them, but Relina disagrees. Anyway, since we're in a Gundam show, it's time for more fencing. Okay, to be fair, there's a lot more fencing in Gundam Wing than any other Gundam show, but it's an obvious nod to the original. So, Dorothy and Hito have a duel and a conversation in the fencing arena. The basic point of the conversation being that Dorothy is completely aware that Hito and Catra are Gundam pilots. She scores a point, but Dorothy knows that Hito threw the fight and keeps pressing him, to which Hito instinctively lands what's inches away from a killing blow. After that, he plays dumb on being a Gundam pilot and walks off. Now after that, we've got a complication. A Treize faction unit is stuck in the southern forest of the Sanc Kingdom, and they've got wounded soldiers. Romefeller is going to run them down, and Relina is not going to let them just kill wounded men, so she decides to take them in as refugees. The Treize faction guys, though, know it's a setup, where they're going to use the Treize faction being there as an excuse to bring war to the Sanc Kingdom, and they want to leave so that this doesn't happen. Now, Lieutenant Noin calls the Treize faction members and presents Relina's offer, but the commander lets Noin know that the Romefeller forces are being reinforced, which obviously means that they're putting together an invasion. The Treize faction guys don't take the offer and terminate communication, with Noin obviously being very broken up over all this because Relina and the nation as a whole are in a rock and a hard place. One way or another, there's going to be a fight and people will die. On the flip side, Hito has found his Gundam, plus some white Taurus suits, one of which is Lieutenant Noin's signature suit for the rest of the show. No breakdown on this one, they're no different than any other Tauruses. Anyway, Relina still tells the Oz units that she's going to call them refugees anyway, but Romefeller's going to be evil and just invade the country anyway because they're dicks. So the Virgo units get launched, and Relina thinks that she can stop them somehow by just talking them down, I guess, which is not a very good idea. But again, as we've realized at this point, she is very naive still. But this is the episode where things get interesting, because we're basically seeing an actual test of Relina's beliefs right in front of her. Right now, Hito, Catra, and Noin know that the only real way to save lives here is to fight, whereas Relina is just going to go and yell at a bunch of Oz mobile dolls, which just means they're either going to keep ignoring her or even worse, take the moment to assassinate her. Hiro goes to the Treize faction guys and basically says, "Come with me if you want to live." They set up a trap for the mobile dolls using the damaged Leo suits as bait. Then, the pilots of the Treize faction take to the air in the Sanc Kingdom's Taurus units, where they're actually able to hold their own with much better mobile suits. A carrier starts flying towards the dolls and does get hit, but it's got a surprise! After that, Catra and Noin show up and make short work of another Virgo. Noin apologizes for the deception with the mobile suits, but she makes the argument that the kingdom does need a defensive force. Hiro also makes the point that these forces aren't enough to put up a long-term fight with Romefeller, and challenges that while Relina's ideas are something that people want and they want to move towards for sure, and in some ways the world is leaning that direction, in the meantime they're gonna need defenses. As for Hiro, he's gonna take Wing Gundam and take the fight to Romefeller. At this point, Relina actually relents, and agrees that if they're going to survive in this sort of a political environment, they will need the means to protect themselves. With all that done, we're back in space. Some Oz soldiers are investigating a spot where a ship is destroyed, and suddenly a shadow appears. And that shadow is Death Scythe. Since I promised last time, let's do a mobile suit breakdown of Duo Maxwell's new suit, which has now been completed. The XXXG01D2 Gundam Death Scythe Hell is the upgraded version of the Death Scythe that effectively makes this suit space combat capable and then some. As you can see, it has what look like a pair of bat wings that serve as an active cloaking device when they fold down. For those wondering, yes, those wings can actually serve as a defensive armor for the mobile suit. As we just saw with that Oz unit, they didn't know Duo was even there until he wanted them to. Now it does have a similar weapons loadout to the original version of Death Scythe, with a set of Vulcans in the head, and an improved version of the Buster Shield with more thrusters and a higher output, plus more durability. On top of that, of course, with the extra durability providing protection for the suit when needed. The beam scythe itself has been fitted with an extra beam emitter, effectively making it double the threat. On top of that, it also has a booster on the back of the scythe to increase the swing speed. Now, one thing to mention is the difference between the Endless Waltz version of this suit compared to the television version, is that the bat wings are a little bit more literal, and can still enclose around the suit if need be. Oddly enough, in the Endless Waltz film, the suit didn't have the Buster Shield and only had a single-bladed scythe. But in the manga, Glory of the Losers, it was given back the double blade, and Buster Shields were mounted as a hip armor, and could be launched from that position. We'll talk a bit more about manga differences with this episode, but one notable thing in this is that Death Scythe could use a beam saber from Wing Zero in that manga, which hints at the idea that these suits could use each other's equipment if the need ever arose. Back to the fight, Duo makes pretty quick work of the Space Leo units, which surprises no one. Death Scythe Hell is so far ahead in development that it's kind of comedic. Anyway, Duo then escapes with a haul of scrap. As for Tuberov, he's not too pleased about the results of the battle. Lieutenant Trant, who we saw before, is out on the search, and this guy's inside of Wing Zero and is running tests with it to figure out its limits. During the tests, he's able to see his own possible fate in the fight, with him getting inevitably overwhelmed by the mobile dolls. Even so, he desperately wants to figure out the system, and if the Gundam pilots are just able to handle a machine like this much better than he could. As for Duo, he's selling scrap for equipment for his mobile suit, but the old guy he talks to knows what he's doing, and drives off without taking payment. We also see that Hildy has left Oz and is working with Duo to give him a hand. Since he hasn't had any communication with the other pilots, he's just going solo for now. Suddenly, Wing Zero! Yeah, Trent tracked him down to get help with his experiments. And by help, he means do it or I'm gonna kill you and everyone in the colony. So Duo relents. He hops into Wing Zero to be a guinea pig, and Trant is devilish enough to have it so that the mobile dolls will attack the colony. Well, Duo does what Duo do, and starts carving up mobile dolls. But it's here that he starts hallucinating. Funnily enough, what Duo sees over and over is hallucinations of the original Death Scythe, and then he starts blasting. He annihilates the mobile dolls with the Buster Rifle, and then turns to fire at one in front of the colony, which is about as disastrous as you would expect. Except, this is a hallucination as well. This is Zero showing him a possible future outcome in the fight. When he comes to, he's got a mobile doll on the end of his beam saber, and he's already won. While Trant is over the moon with the results, Oz is here to take him in. So Trant takes Wing Zero from Duo, and goes on the attack as Duo gets picked up by Hildy. Tuberov orders Trant to be killed, and the fight is on. As you'd imagine, these guys in Space Leos don't have enough to stop him. But as we saw in the duo battle, one possible outcome is that the colony could get caught in the crossfire, which is bad. We've seen what Wing Zero does to colonies. So for those of you who aren't sure why Duo saw what he saw, the Zero is essentially telling him to stop Trant or people are going to get killed. Trant finishes the Oz mobile suits off, but as he turns to destroy the colony in the crossfire, like Zero warned, Duo steps in. Now, Duo's outmatched by Wing Zero. Even with death-size upgrades, Wing Zero is still more powerful. Eventually, as the fight goes on, Trant sees a harrowing hallucination of Duo blowing them both up as a possibility, and understandably gets freaked out. Eventually, the Zero system overwhelms Trant after Duo deflects a blast from Wing Zero with his shield, killing Trant, and then Wing Zero just floats off into space. Now, one thing that people wanted me to mention in the chat of one of my live streams was the difference between Endless Walt's timeline here, but there's not a whole lot to say. In essence, the first time Duo meets Hildy is here, and those events play out like we talked about with the last episode. And then Duo picks up Death Scythe Hell on a resource satellite that Trant ends up destroying. The two fight, but in this case, Wing Zero, called Proto Zero at this point in the manga, is destroyed and then left to float in space, where afterwards Duo ends up fighting Zex in the Tall Geese Flugel. Now what's the Tall Geese Flugel? It's a tall geese with giant angel wings. I'm not doing a long breakdown of it, that's all it is. I already talked about the weapons in the last episode. Basically what this exists to do is act as a sort of space flight mode for the Tall Geese, which it didn't really need, because the Tall Geese Vernier system already does that in the anime, but whatever. It looks cool, I understand rule of cool, it's fine. I actually do want a model kit of this at some point. It's just one of those things where it's like, you're kind of just doing this to give a reason for Wing Zero to have wings, because that's what ends up happening. It explains how Wing Zero gets wings. Howard takes what's left of Wing Zero, takes what's left of the Tall Geese Flugel, and then fixes them up into the actual Wing Zero with the wings as it looks like in the animated movie of Endless Waltz. Bing, bang, boom. There you go. Back on Earth, Noin and Catra talk about the situation at hand. Catra still blames himself for what happened to Troa, rightly so, and they discuss the upcoming fights. Basically, to beat the Virgo units, they're gonna need Gundams. Even so, Catra and Hiro are a bit restless in the Sanc Kingdom. Back in space, Miliardo is back, and he's fucking up Oz troop transports to keep Operation Nova from sending more mobile dolls to Earth. As we see, the Tall Geese does pretty solid against the mobile dolls, since it's fast enough to get into melee range. He then buries his beam saber into the final ship as a nice little middle finger. Also, pay attention to this little camera angle as the Tall Geese shows up and then buries in the beam saber. We're gonna see it again later, trust me. Anyway, it's here that we see the Peace Million, a massive, massive starship that is piloted by Howard. There's not really a whole lot to it. It's just a giant ship that is a mobile troop transport. Anyway, one thing that's notable is that Miliardo is wearing his mask again. The significance of this is sort of hinted at with what Catra said on Earth to Noin, but also the duality of Zex Marquise and Miliardo Peacecraft. Under the mask, Zex has an identity that is easy to slip into. He's at this point a former Oz lieutenant colonel, and it's easy for him to just be a soldier. He can't really serve as an ambassador at this point because it's just not fitting him. Miliardo Peacecraft doesn't really have an identity of his own, but Zex Marquise is already figured out. He's basically been on the battlefield for too long, so he slips back into his old role as the Honorable Lieutenant Zex, the Lightning Count. Now, one thing that Howard notices about Zex is that he's become such a good pilot that he's starting to outpace his own mobile suit, which says something crazy considering how fucking powerful the Tall Geese is. Anyway, at this point, Romefeller's not too pleased about the goings-on, and end up inviting Relina to speak at a conference that they're hosting. Now, this basically screams the word, trap! Meanwhile, Hiro lets Catra know that Oz plans on attacking the Treize faction's headquarters in Luxembourg, dispersing a massive amount of mobile dolls on Earth afterwards. Hiro takes Wing Gundam to intercept, leaving Catra behind to keep up the search for Troa. Zex sees the same thing in space, seeing a bunch of carriers getting deployed, and decides to basically do the same thing that Wing Gundam's going to do before these mobile suits land on Luxembourg. Still, the fight begins, with the dolls given orders to ignore Zex and head to Earth. As for the speech in front of the Romefeller Foundation that Relina's been grabbed for, it goes over about as well as a fart in an elevator. During the talk that Relina is giving, Duke Dermeo brings up as a counter to her beliefs in total pacifism, is that, well, he accuses her basically of using her brother against the forces out in space, and basically says, if you believe in peace, well then why is a peacecraft going around in a Tallgeese shooting stuff up? Relina basically bluffs at this point, saying, that's not my brother. Now Dermail knows it's BS. He's known who Zex Marquise is for a while, and basically the whole thing was an attempt to try to trip up Relina into sticking up for her brother, which they would then use as an excuse to invade her nation. Up in space, Zex is doing some good damage, but a bunch of ships still got past him. As such, the battle at Luxembourg ends up beginning, and is going about as well as you'd expect until Hiro gets there to help out. As Noin and Catra are talking back in the Sanc Kingdom, we also see the other intention of Relina's meeting was an assassination attempt, which sends Noin and Catra into action. The mobile dolls, which are being deployed as an excuse of, well, an exercise in the area, attack Relina's car and completely disable it. But before they can kill her and Pagan already being badly injured, Noin and Catra come in and make short work of the mobile dolls in their Taurus suits. Pagan's pretty badly hurt though, and it just shows the lengths that Duke Dermail is willing to go to kill Relina. As for Luxembourg, it goes without saying that Oz playing the numbers games was the smart move. They're dominating the fight even with Hiro's help. As Hiro's in a tough spot, he hears a voice over the radio.
Don't die. Don't give up. You mustn't die yet. Fight. Keep fighting and prolong your life, kid. You pilots, you mustn't die yet.
Yeah, Treize is fully aware of what's going on here. Hiro does try to keep going, but he's completely overwhelmed. Now he does get saved last minute by some Treize faction soldiers who kamikaze the mobile dolls in front of him. The last words of one of the pilots is to protect Treize. So, Hiro heads to Treize's estate. Duke Dermail's pretty pissed that they're not winning, and especially doesn't like, well, why they're not winning. Now, why are they doing so well in Luxembourg? Random guy with a penis-shaped haircut.
A Gundam.
Thank you, random guy with a penis-shaped haircut. Either way, Dermail redirects more troops to Luxembourg to stomp them out. At this point, for the very first time, we get a meeting between Hiro Yui and Treize Kushrenada. Now, Treize actually starts out by offering an easy kill to end the fighting in Luxembourg, and Hiro doesn't take it. At this point, Treize lets Hiro know that his intention for the past few months was to inevitably try and parlay with the Gundam pilots. It's an interesting conversation between the two, with Treize effectively outplaying Hiro and using his philosophy of who Hiro's enemies are against him. But at the same time, Hiro's belief is that Treize's idea that his battle is over is bullshit. At this point in the conversation, Treize says he has a guide that will show Hiro how to live from here on. It's here that Treize Kushrenada unveils a monster, clad in crimson, that we're not going to talk about yet. Up in space! Wing Zero has been found, and Oz troops are going to try to blow it up. However, Zex and Howard have found them and plan to intercept and steal it. So, Zex takes out the Tallgeese to take him out. An Oz soldier manages to get out a distress signal, and in come the reinforcements. Like Luxembourg, the plan is to overwhelm the Tallgeese with sheer numbers. At this point, between the numbers and the suit lagging behind his abilities, Zex knows that this is the end for his old friend. So, he exits the cockpit and self-detonates the Tallgeese, taking a few mobile dolls with him. Thing is, both he and the Tallgeese got their objective, because Zex gets into Wing Zero, and the Oz soldier that had set the satchel charges tries to blow it up. Yeah, because that's gonna do it. Predictably, Wing Zero emerges from the explosion without a scratch and fucking annihilates everything. Yeah, if there's one thing scarier than Zex and a Tallgeese, it's Zex and a fucking Gundam. As for the Beast of Crimson, let's go back to that, because this thing has been given the name Epyon. The OZ-13MS Gundam Epyon was created based on data from the Tallgeese and the other Gundams, and was designed by Treize Kushrenada himself. For those curious, the Gundanium being shipped to Earth earlier in the show was actually meant to be for this suit, but because Hiro had destroyed that carrier, it delayed the creation of the Epyon. This mobile suit, like Wing Gundam and Wing Zero, does have a Wave Rider mode that can be used for quick transport, though it is called a mobile armor mode instead. It stands 17.4 meters tall and weighs a little under 9 tons when completely empty. To reflect its creator's desire for honorable battle, the Epyon is fitted almost purely with melee weaponry. It carries a beam sword that is connected straight to the suit's reactor via a cord, allowing for the length and intensity of the beam saber to be adjusted for different purposes. since it's pulling energy straight from the reactor. It also has a shield, and mounted on that shield is a whip-like chain called the heat rod, capable of carving through a mobile suit like a hot knife through butter. As you probably guessed, these armaments are pretty similar to the Goof from the Universal Century, which I'm pretty sure was the intention. Later on, the Epyon would also be given a pair of Vulcan guns in its head, and would be affixed with another weapon in the manga version called the Sturm und Drang. If the name sounds familiar, it's the final attack of the Shadow Gundam in G Gundam. In this case with the Epyon, these were two small wing-like devices that would work like planet defensors that the Mercurius had, or they could attach to the beam sword to increase its power even more. The kicker for the Epyon is the system inside the cockpit, the Epyon system. It operates the same way as Wing Zero's, but requires the pilot to wear a special helmet. Now when Treize is talking to Hiro, he is being a bit cryptic, or so it seems. Like Wing Zero, Epyon's system is a probability engine that does one thing differently. It will actually show you the face of the person you're fighting before you kill them, fitting into Treize's belief that a soldier should understand the depth of their decision to fight, kill, and die for what they believe in. Essentially, Treize has created a mobile suit to carve out the future, and this will show Hiro the way forward. As such, Hiro hops in and goes out to kick ass. Back at the main base of the Treize faction, they're getting overwhelmed by the mobile dolls. When the Epyon comes in, as you can imagine, it gets a fucking badass intro, and Hiro immediately gets to work. The Epyon is so fucking fast that the mobile dolls can't even keep up with it. The thing is, the system is fucking with Hiro's head, and he can't bring himself initially to kill other humans, until it seems like the Epyon system overwhelms him. Anyone who fights is my enemy becomes his declaration, and he just fucking slaughters everybody and everything around him until he has a bit of a Vietnam flashback to all the stuff he promised that he was going to do. And he lurches when he realizes that he just killed everything. So, he lands the Epyon at Treize's estate, looking like he just saw a ghost. Treize offers Hiro a pistol to finally kill him, but Hiro flat out says, "I don't have the right to do it," and finally passes out. After that battle, we find Troa just wandering out in the rain. Now, luckily for him, Catherine finds him, and we can see that the poor guy now has amnesia. In another place, we're at Wu Fei's colony that we talked about in episode 1, which you're going to want to go back and watch the significance of that colony if you haven't seen it already. Because there's some deep lore here that I'm going to briefly touch on, but I go into more detail in episode 1. But anyway, this was the colony that the original Operation Meteor was going to use to drop on Earth. Wu Fei's master talks to him about Wu Fei's inner struggles that still dwell inside of him, and once he deals with those inner struggles, defeats himself basically, he'll be able to pilot Ultron properly. His master very much believes that that colony's time is basically done, and Wu Fei has to be prepared for the future. It's at this point that Oz attacks the colony, and Wu Fei heads into action. Wu Fei makes really short work of the first wave of Oz troops, and the last thing that an Oz trooper sees before he dies is a now completed Ultron. The XXXG-01S2 Ultron Gundam is the upgraded version of the Shenlong that effectively took the original ideas and put them on fucking cocaine. This sucker stands 16.4 meters tall, weighing a little under 8 tons. While it's still very much a close-range powerhouse, the upgrades on this mobile suit gave it medium-range options as well. Instead of just one Dragon Fang on the forearm, now both of the Ultron's arms have them, and can even extend longer on top of having flamethrowers. The Ultron now has a tail that fires 2 beam cannons derived from the same tech that powered the V8. It still has the same Vulcan guns that it had before, and also has a shield, plus instead of a beam glaive, it uses a twin beam trident that's used to devastating effect at close range. Now, the Endless Waltz version's a little different. Though I do think the Endless Waltz version is the better looking suit, the main difference that you're going to notice between the two is the lack of a tail and back wings. Now, Glory of the Losers does restore it and the back wings that it has, but it also gives it dragon claws that are independent of the forearms, and instead are long-reaching shields that can be used offensively or defensively. Now, when it comes to the fight, Wu Fei just does Wu Fei things and starts murking mobile suits and mobile dolls and Oz troopers left and right. The thing is, Master Long knows that they're going to just try and use that colony as a shield, and eventually they would get used as a weapon as well. As such, the clans evacuated the cities, at least I would think so, and they decide to destroy the colony. As you'd expect, Wu Fei does not take this well, and finishes the battle, with extreme prejudice. Zex and Howard get word of what happened, and Zex has the idea of trying to recruit Wu Fei to help fight Romefeller. At this point, Dermail declares Operation Nova a success. He unveils something he wants created at this point, a space battleship, the size of Peace Million or even bigger. He calls it Peace Million class, so you know it's going to be huge. Over in the desert, we find Catra, who had been shot down, unfortunately, when he was in a jet, but he got intel from Sally Poe where the Maglonac Corps is. Relina, on the other hand, is meeting with other national leaders, and they're not too happy with what Romefeller is doing. Basically, they're realizing that everything Romefeller does is just creating a cycle of conflict instead of actually solving a problem. So they want Relina's guidance on how to pull this pacifism that she's preaching, well, off. How exactly do we do it is the question. Like she's mentioned before, the only way to do it is for Romefeller to disarm. As for the Sanc Kingdom, we see that Hiro's brought Epyon back to help with the defense forces here. As for Noin, she and Hiro talk about why she's folded the Treize faction soldiers left over into the Sanc Kingdom's guard. She shows Hiro that the forces left over from Luxembourg are prepping to invade the Sanc Kingdom. Their only option to repel an invasion like this is to take in the leftovers from the Treize faction and the Alliance to help serve the Sanc Kingdom. Noin even notes that these soldiers are effectively rallying around Epyon, because it's a suit that Treize created. It's sort of a symbol of him. Back in space, Oz retreats from Wu Fei, and Peace Million arrives to try and chat with the young pilot. Zex tries to convince Wu Fei that they need to fight together against Romefeller, but every time Zex tries to reason with him, Wu Fei just comes up with an excuse not to listen to him, and he just won't fucking hear it. So, we get the only battle between Zex and Wu Fei in the entire show, and to Wu Fei's credit, he does hold his own against Zero. What screws Zex over is the Zero system, which shows him a vision of him destroying Peace Million by accident, and then another possibility of Wu Fei killing him in the battle. In reality, Zex, in this crazed madness, ends up winging Peace Million with a shot from the Buster Rifle during the fight, with Wu Fei realizing that this isn't going to work out, and states plainly he can tell they're going to end up as enemies. Back with Troa and Catherine, the circus is packing up early due to a nearby Gundam sighting. Hearing about the Gundam, it brings up some repressed feelings of coldness for Troa, likely subconsciously remembering the results of his fight with Catra. In a hidden place, former soldiers meet with Duo at his colony about how to go forward, but Duo just tells them that he can't ally with anyone until they know what's going to happen after the war's over. In the Sanc Kingdom, Oz's forces have moved onto the border. Noin informs Relina that attack is inevitable, and Relina wants to parley with Duke Dermail to try and talk him down. The clash behind the scenes is that Noin thinks trying to talk about this is pointless. As she talks with Hiro about it in the hangar, they're basically discussing the hope for total pacifism. But the reality is there's going to be a fight first. As for Catra, he does end up finding the Maglonac Corps fighting against Virgo units, but not having a whole lot of luck. During the fight, the Maglonac see Catra out in the field. As we already knew, they got their hands on something special. After that, the Maglonac Corps push back, and a familiar silhouette comes out of the smoke. Yep, Sandrock's here. And given that the Virgo units don't do well against melee combat, you can imagine how the battle ends. At this point, Catra recruits everyone to head back to the Sanc Kingdom with him to go kick ass. Back to Hildy and Duo, they head to the circus for some fun, and see none other than Troa Barton doing Troa Barton things. As you'd expect, Duo recognizes him immediately, and after the show tries to approach him. Also, as you'd expect, Troa is very confused due to the amnesia, and Duo's pretty busted up seeing his friend in such bad shape. Elsewhere, as time has gone on, this symbol of strength of a battleship that Duke Dermail wants built is still under construction and coming along quite nicely, and he tells Tubarov that the invasion of the Sanc Kingdom is commencing. The reason? Because they took in Oz deserters. Basically, the game was rigged from the start. In response, Noin gets the Royal Guard prepped for the fight, and Relina evacuates the students. We also see Hiro in the Epyon, and he's having a really rough fucking time trying to control that beast and stop it from what it's telling him to do. Even with the difficulties, the attack commences, and the Sanc Kingdom's troops are overwhelmed pretty quickly. It's basically, at start, just tanks and Leos, plus a few Ares and Taurus units against everything Romefeller has, and they're getting dropped fast. Now, luckily for Noin, Catra and the Maglonac Corps arrive just in time to help out and even the numbers. As for Relina, Dorothy's here basically just to talk shit, and challenge the fact that her beliefs really aren't working in the situation she's in. Total pacifism isn't just gonna friggin' work against those who want to fight. On the flippity-flop, Romefeller's idea of rule and control isn't going to work long-term either, because it's not peace, it's domination. And that creates those who want to rebel. Back with the fight, Hiro's having trouble with Epyon and advances further down the line than where Noin wants him. Basically, just so he doesn't attack any of his allies like he did in Luxembourg. The fact is that even though Sandrock and Epyon are there, and they're two Gundams that are very good against Virgo suits, Romefeller's numbers just keep going up because they're throwing everything that they can at the Sanc Kingdom. Gunfire is spreading into the city and even hitting the academy that Relina teaches at. At this point in her conversation with Dorothy, Relina realizes what she's playing at. Dorothy is trying to bait her into requesting help from more troops. Hiro even has a vision of Relina being killed, freaking him out, and that should give you an idea of how bad the battle is. At this point, Relina puts out an open broadcast. She talks about Oz's declaration of war, and everyone figures she's about to ask for help. Immediately, Zex takes off in Wing Zero from Peace Million, but as he goes, he watches the broadcast and Relina shocks her brother by saying she's renouncing the sovereignty of her nation and surrenders her country to Romefeller. The Sanc Kingdom, the very nation that her brother worked so hard to free from the Alliance, is now under the heel of Romefeller. As the Sanc Kingdom burns, Catra and Noin resolve to head back to space for what's coming next. Relina is taken to the Romefeller Foundation, but in the mountains, Hiro is not done fighting. He continues to strike against Oz's mobile suits with the intent of having them burn, just like the flames in the Sanc Kingdom's capital. At this point, Zex arrives on Earth while Hiro is continuing to clean up the Oz forces in the mountains, as he continues to say, "Where is my enemy?" It's at a point where Oz soldiers are retreating from the fight with Epyon, and while the heads of the Mobile Doll Division debate leaving, Hiro makes the decision for them. Ouch. Anyway, at this point, Wing Zero and Zex have arrived. Alright, sure, dude, let's get the fight counter up, because it's the next round of Zex Marquise versus Hiro Yui. Let's go, ring the bell. During this back and forth fight, Zex is shown he's too late. The Sanc Kingdom is gone, and he doesn't even know what the point of all this fighting is anymore. At this point, Zex consigns himself that the only battle he has left is to kill those who want him dead. Elsewhere, Romefeller plans on sending more mobile dolls out to bring down Epyon and Wing Zero. We see that Relina is now under the thumb of Romefeller, under the watch of Duke Dermail. However, Dermail's intentions aren't what Relina thinks. Duke Dermail speaks with words sweet as honey, but it's ultimately BS, as we in the audience know. He plans on using Relina as a propaganda tool, and wants to make her the chief representative of the Romefeller Foundation. Her popularity will be used to bring the entire world under Romefeller's heel as Queen Relina. She attempts to decline the offer, but Dermail basically says if she doesn't take this role, the wars will keep going, and people will keep dying. Back with Hiro and Zex, the two mobile suits are evenly matched. It gets to a point where both the Zero system and the Epyon system start overwhelming both Hiro and Zex's brains, replaying the same things over and over, with the fight just continuing onwards in the computers. At this point, the suits shut down, and the pilots get out. So, we're going to call this fight between Zex and Hiro a draw, putting the record at 2-1-1, with 2 wins for Zex, 1 win for Hiro, and 1 draw. Now, while Tuberov talks some shit in space, what he doesn't really realize is that things are about to change. You see, Romefeller's been infiltrated. Like Relina called, domination does not create peace. Members of the Treize faction, among others, have now become a revolutionary group representing the colonies, and the Artemis Revolution begins. This new group is led by none other than a friend of ours from the first episode, Cans. Yeah, this group is called the White Fang. They broadcast a message to all the colonies that this group is going to strike back against Romefeller and get them out to give the colonies their freedom. If you watch the speech and it sounds kinda Xeon, it's supposed to be, and Duo sees right through it. Back in space, Tuberov manages to get free on the lunar base, but takes a gunshot to the shoulder as he tries to escape. Thing is, he gets to his room and starts activating mobile dolls to try to break him out. As you'd expect, the mobile dolls start mowing through the space Leos that are there. However, Wu Fei is here, and he's fucking up everybody. Like Duo had said, this shit's just gonna bring more war, and Wu Fei knows that. And while he starts nuking the lunar base, the explosions rock the base and Tuberov gets blown to bits. R.I.P. in pepperoni, you ostentatiously dressed anal wart. Now, even with Wu Fei wrecking the lunar base, the White Fang group now has control of the space station that Romefeller was constructing. Back on Earth, Zex and Hiro are talking, with Hiro mentioning that Epyon told him that Zex was going to inevitably be an obstacle to him. It's at this point that Hiro tosses the Epyon's pilot helmet to Zex, and that he, as in Hiro, is taking Wing Zero. He doesn't want Epyon anymore because it's built by Treize. He doesn't understand how Treize thinks. At this point, Wing Zero awakens with Hiro in its cockpit once again. Hiro immediately gets to work in wrecking Romefeller's forces by sea. As for Zex, he takes off an Epyon to kick the crap out of some mobile dolls as well. Relina seems to sense something in the distance, and at this point, she finally consents to becoming the chief representative of Romefeller. Next time on Gundam Wing Explained, war has begun again. Even after taking her place as Queen Relina, nothing will stop the White Fang from beginning their war against anyone that they believe is there to suppress the colonies. A familiar face is revealed as White Fang's new leader, and the conflict begins. Peace, war, revolution. As one conflict will end, another one will begin shortly after, by the daughter of a familiar face. An endless waltz going on forever, and all our heroes are caught up in the dance. Next time, episode number 4, The Endless Waltz.